Just a quick warning, this episode contains some strong language, so be advised, shit's about to get real. I'm staring at a Final Cut project called Counterintelligence Full. Empty timeline. If I hadn't been editing all the way through production, I'd be completely overwhelmed. This timeline would be the resting place for the full first cut. At this point, the rough cut was broken into separate sequences, but it's all there. It's all edited down and condensed in standalone scenes. For the first time in my life and career, I have the full first cut completely done within 2 weeks of wrapping production. It just needs to be copied and pasted. And I'm sweating. It's been said that throughout the filmmaking process you make 3 distinct films, one when you write, another in production, and the final in post. Rarely will the page translate straight to the screen. The Coen brothers and Hitchcock are who and what they are for a reason. Most films, they need to be worked out. They go through phases of being, and quite often, where you start isn't necessarily where you end up. The hard part is clarity, remaining true to the movie you're trying to make. That challenge only intensifies the longer you work on your project. Because with every passing day, every little tweak, revision, addition, and decision, your vision can morph while you simultaneously get closer and closer to the work, more intimate. So, sitting in front of that empty project, it was time to discover how production changed Counterintelligence. Time to figure out if I'd let the movie go completely off the rails. Time to paste and just watch the fucking thing already.
An expression.
It was time to cut this movie.
A free film. For no money, for no anything. Half of the battle to make a good film in the United States. A free film, I say good film, it's a free film. Whether it's good or bad, we don't know. But we'll put a year in for no money, for no anything. Simply because there's an expression that has to be said. Now, we don't have any reverence for this expression. We don't believe it's a church. We have to have a good time, otherwise we die. I mean, how much does this cost? You know, paper to do the hard work, and how much does reels cost? We get it all from the major studios. They help us destroy them. That's the way we work. Because if we make a good film, they will only suffer. And as they suffer, they come and they say, please make films for us, and we say, no, we don't want to make films for you. Hip, hip, hooray.
Before we circle back to that first rough cut, we need to talk workflow. Here's the deal. I edit as a profession. It's a huge part of my day job, and efficiency is one of my corners on the market. I'm well attuned to my own process, slightly augmenting it on each new project. As my career's plugged along, I've continued to whittle down the hurdles in the post-process to the minimum possible. And that trimming of the fat continues as each project presents new speed bumps. I actually thrive on this. I love it. I eat that shit up. One thought process that informs this refining is shared by many others who are obsessed with productivity and efficiency. This includes fellow filmmaker Noam Kroll, host of the fantastic podcast Show Don't Tell.
Whatever we're doing, whatever state that we're in, whatever current projects we're working on can always be improved, can always be made more efficient, and we should always be looking for ways as filmmakers to increase our productivity, increase our efficiency, and do so in ways that are truly going to allow us to maximize the amount of time that we're putting into something and reap the most benefits without killing ourselves in the process.
Noam was nice enough to let me use excerpts from his wonderful Show Don't Tell episode entitled Maximizing Creative Results and Profits by Applying the 80-20 Principle to Filmmaking. Even the title to this episode was music to my ears because Noam and I share an affinity for a book that apparently changed both our lives for the better.
What I really almost enjoyed, I'd say most about this 4-Hour Workweek book when I read it was his explanation of the power of this 80-20 principle.
My Showhawk co-founder Mike gave me the 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss about 5 years back, and it drastically altered my perception of process, organization, self-sustenance, and the meaning of work overall. I wrote 2 Showhawk blog posts early on that employed this 80-20 principle, espoused by Tim Ferriss. One post was on screenwriting, the other on gear. Ferriss's reference to this principle also changed my professional life forever. Noam echoes that for himself.
In this past year, I've been able to minimize the amount of time that I spend on work I do not want to do, while continuing to grow my own income and continuing to open up more free time for the projects that I really want to work on. I by no means have fully cracked this code yet. I'm still learning and I'm still trying to improve my own process, and I'm sure I will be for the rest of my career. But we always need to look for these ways to increase efficiency, to make our lives easier, and to make our creative work that much stronger. And if there's one thing that you can do, I think it's really wrap your head around this principle.
The 80-20 principle, also called the Pareto principle, originally belongs to Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto. By the way, not enough people are discussing how cool that name is. Tim Ferriss popularized the concept in his book and has made quite the career out of evangelizing it through the worlds of health and wellness, tech, media, and life hacking. He's an OG life hacker, if not the OG. So what is 80-20 exactly?
The 80-20 principle essentially states that 80% of the results that you get, in any way positive or negative, can almost always be attributed to a maximum of 20% of your effort.
So 80% of your results come from 20% of your work.
Let's say you're a freelancer. 80% of the income that you make may come from only 20% of your clients. And that may sound crazy, but if you actually look into how you're making your money, where it's coming from, which clients are most consistent, where you're putting your effort, that is, I found to be, as just an example, extremely accurate. The same could be said for something that's negative. 80% of the stress or anxiety that you may be caused by a certain project may really just be from 20% of the work that you're doing on that project.
If you're in post-production on a film, according to Pareto's principle, 80% of your success comes from 20% of the work in the process. On the flip, 80% of your post-production stress also comes from 20% of that process.
Because there's good stress that should be there when you realize something's not working and I should go and reshoot something, or I should spend more time on this. That's fine. You can't get around everything. There's going to be some friction there, and that's totally normal and fine. But it's the unnecessary stuff that if 80% of your stress could be eliminated, and the 20% of your stress is the stuff that you really should be focusing on, that's the goal that you want to get to.
Now we're getting closer to how the 80-20 principle relates to editing, more specifically, to cutting counterintelligence. The reason this episode of Show Don't Tell really hit me, beyond Noam's and my mutual affinities for efficiency, Pareto, and Ferriss, was that the post-production example he gave matched my own experience to a T. And his example came from editing his own micro-budget feature, also coming soon, Shadows on the Road.
Oftentimes what I was stressed out over were the moments where I was stuck in the technical facets of what I was doing. And I'm a very technically oriented person. As many of you guys know that follow my blog, I love storytelling, but I also love cameras and color correction and LUTs and all sorts of technical stuff. So it's not that I'm not informed when it comes to the technical importance of what I should be and how I should be spending my effort in that regard during the editing process. However, I know that when I'm in a creative state of mind and I'm bogged down by a technicality, whether it's having not set up the drive properly, or having something crash, or having to resync footage, it's a totally different side of the brain that you're using. And it's really frustrating when you're trying to be creative and then all of a sudden the project that you're working on crashes, and you realize that you have not necessarily synced your dailies properly. They didn't sync automatically properly. So now you have to spend a couple of hours manually syncing stuff that should have worked automatically. Those are the kind of things that really, really are stressful.
I'm also a technically adept person in post. Again, it's my living. It's the split brain problem he cited. The fact that the creative editing process, the one that shapes the finished film and should demand most of your focus, operates in a different hemisphere than footage logging, organization, hardware troubleshooting, etc.
I was too far deep into it to fix some of those issues, quite frankly, in time. So I ended up just having to kind of muscle through some of those technical issues myself.
The problem is, if you make mistakes up front on the technical side, you'll have to power through them later. If you're doing all this alone, you have no one to turn to but yourself. These technical distractions can throw off the creative rhythm significantly. This knocked on my door multiple times. Little oversights reared their ugly head down the line. And another component to this, those and other technically specific processes can be monotonous and tiresome. Just getting through them demands a lot of energy that could be put into sculpting the creative vision, the third and final film you make out of your narrative. In the warm glow of hindsight, Noam and I came to damn near the same conclusion.
But in the future, what I would do is put aside just a small amount of my budget to bring on board an assistant editor that could deal with those issues and could deal with things beforehand, could help sync my dailies, could help prep the footage and just organize and label and log everything. So when I go to edit, I don't have to use that side of my brain necessarily right away. Not that you shouldn't know these things, but just that it's hard to work with both sides of your brain at the same time. I certainly do not know how to do that, and I don't think it's a good idea to do it for me personally. And if you want to be focusing on the creative edit of your own movie, which in itself is an extremely difficult thing to do, then do whatever you need to do, whether it's just mentally separating your time to only work on technical things one day and only work on creative work the next day, or bringing someone on board that can help you set up your project and can help you when you do hit snags and when you've been editing for a couple weeks and you hit a wall or there's a technical problem or you need to transfer now your footage to a different RAID because you had a drive fail, whatever it may be. In those types of scenarios, it doesn't matter if you can do it yourself or not. If it's causing you stress, if it's going to make you resistant to working on your own project creatively, and if it's going to create kind of negative emotions around your experience working on the project, it is money well spent to bring someone else in or to create a system or whatever it may be to manage those issues.
That's right. Either spend the money on an extra set of hands to execute those technical tasks and save the creative work for you, or, at the very least, create systems. I did the latter based on past experiences, and even, as Noam said, was good to compartmentalize different tasks into separate days, which definitely helped that split brain problem. But, down the line, I would bring in that second set of hands. Thing is, if you do bring them in, you could hopefully keep them around, or, to save money, on call, to help you troubleshoot possible problems down the line. Remember in episode 2 on budgeting when I said I hit an unforeseen storage wall and had to invest in more hard drives? Well, naturally, all the work I'd done already needed to be copied over and organized so nothing came detached, got lost, or unlinked from the projects. And guess who had to do that? Yep. That was time I could have spent elsewhere and a weekend lost. The need for another party even popped up down the line in sound mixing, which we'll get into next episode. Just know that when you approach your editing process from an 80-20 standpoint up front, scrutinizing all the variables in the equation, focusing on which are most crucial to telling the best story and which lend the most useless stress to the process, you'll have a better grasp on how to approach post as a whole and maximize your creative output. For the full episode and the rest of Noam Kroll's awesome catalog, check out Show Don't Tell on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check out Noam's website, noamkroll.com, listed in the show notes. And if you're a micro-budget filmmaker, definitely sign up for his newsletter. It's a fantastic tool. Back to Counterintelligence editing. I cut the movie in Final Cut Pro X. Now, I know FCPX is a polarizing piece of software in the filmmaking world. It's caused many a filmmaker to move away from Apple and over to Adobe and Avid. However, I love FCPX. I've been using it from its beginning, and it just speaks to my sensibilities. I've been evangelizing it for a long time. I feel like I'm screaming into a void sometimes. For my needs, it's just a more intuitive piece of software for the creative mind, with fewer antiquated technical functions. Does it have its liabilities and shortcomings? Sure, of course it does. I had to grapple with some of them on this project, which we'll also get into next episode. However, to my mind, every tool has its foibles, and I just prefer these foibles to others. And having been in from the ground floor, Apple's improvements over the years have spoken to their focused attention on listening to users while pushing the envelope. I'm not going to bore you with my specifics on organization, to each their own. In a nutshell, I used a drive to house all of my footage and assets and had Final Cut reference them with a library on a separate drive. I mounted these drives in a double hard drive dock, needing both hooked up at the same time. The reference drive had folders organizing footage into the days they were shot, with additional folders for sound effects, music, etc. I'd bring these assets in as needed. On each shoot day, I'd bring the footage in and organize it. Then, when I received sound recordings from Tim, I'd synchronize them to the video footage into synced clips, which I'd begin cutting. As the production days and weeks plugged along, I created separate projects for each sequence in the film we'd covered. I'd cut these sequences separately, finessing each into their best and tightest forms, independent of one another. Pretty simple, and like I said in the beginning, about 2 weeks after we wrapped, each linear sequence had been refined to the best point possible on its own. Some sequences were harder than others. For instance, remember this?
It was challenging because there was a lot of dialogue, which oftentimes in today's filming, it's more reaction shots.
That was Jerry Basham, who played Phil on day 5 of shooting. And a lot of that dialogue, which read fine on paper, ran way too long while we shot. Despite the great performances being delivered, the scene meandered, which we couldn't have known until it was being performed, but it was palpable on set. Another case in favor of doing table reads in advance. But my remedy on set was to have them improvise, which I could inject to move the scene along and wake it up in post. The result was a sequence that was about twice as long as it needed to be, if not more. It required a great deal of attention. At one point, I showed the earliest cut I was happy with to my friend and former co-producer David Pennington, who you heard from in episode 3. About a minute in, he said, in true David form, "Turn it off." My heart sank. He said, "This is way too long, man." There was a long silence. Then he said, "Okay, keep playing it." I tentatively hit the space bar. When the scene ended 5 minutes later, he thought for a moment, then gave me a beat-by-beat rundown of what needed to stay and what needed to go. So after the initial burn wore off, I went to work, and from that painful session came the 2.5-minute scene in the finished film, down from 6.5 minutes. See, as an editor, you're cutting for the audience. As an editor, writer, director, producer, you're not the best audience because you know every bit of work that went into every single frame. And that's where outside perspectives come in. Here's co-producer, art director, Dre Tolbert.
I feel like there were scenes that were too long that I said snip it. There were scenes that needed to move quickly, quicker. Because since I was a part of it, I knew what shots you had. You know, everyone is different in the way that they watch movies and like movies. It's important to have a scene breathe, and it's important to have a scene be snappier. Is that like the technical term, snappy?
It can work.
Snappy.
Pacing is everything, especially when your film is playing in a genre sandbox like ours. It was a huge priority of mine to rule out boredom and keep the story firing ahead at all times. Often this requires input from others to fine-tune the rhythm and ensure the film is working how you intended it to. Soon, the braintrust from episode 1 on writing the script would be brought back, but not until these individual sequences were combined into that counterintelligence full timeline. the one that made me sweat. I recently took the Martin Scorsese Masterclass through the Masterclass platform. In it, he says,
if you don't get physically ill seeing your first rough cut, something's wrong. You always think you're not going to get physically ill, but you do.
Now, this was mitigated for me a bit because I'd been cutting the sequences along the way and knew to a great extent they stood pretty well on their own. But really, nothing can prepare you for the time you sit down and watch the first cut all the way through. While I was, to some extent, relieved by aspects of the first cut, one of the biggest editing hurdles I'd confront became glaringly obvious. My opening, the first 7 or so minutes, as written, wasn't working.
Hey, Fred. What's up? Abel, how are you doing? Fine. Good. What's up? Work's okay? Yeah. Just the usual thing. What's up? Well, I have some pretty exciting news. Are you ready? Sure.
As a refresher, the setup for the story is that our male protagonist, Abel, takes part in a botched field operation, sending him on the run and driving him to kidnap our female protagonist, Angela, while he hides out to assess his options. On the page, the film opens with Abel being approached by his boss, Fred, who informs him he's going out in the field for the first time.
I thought, Field op, yes. It turns out one of our sister agencies needs completion, and bing bong, you were chosen. Pretty exciting stuff, huh? And it's very, very low risk. You're just getting your feet wet, and there's nothing to worry about.
The script seamlessly interweaves this interaction with snippets of the operation itself as it crumbles, leaving mystery surrounding what caused the crumble in the first place, and hinting at later explanation. It was a montage showing cause and effect simultaneously. The sound and occasional sight of Abel being given the job by Fred, playing over the job, going absolutely haywire. And it was modeled after one of my favorite openings in contemporary cinematic history.
Of course it's you. Who else could they send? Who else could be trusted? I know it's a long way and you're ready to go to work. All I'm saying is wait. Just wait. Just please hear me out, because this is not an episode. Relapse. Fuck up. I'm begging you, Michael. I'm begging you. Try and make believe this is not just madness, because this is not just madness.
Michael Clayton was a movie that Mike Elliott and I revisited frequently while making Counterintelligence. From early scripting, I'd studied Clayton's opening as a blueprint for setting a large stage through flowing nighttime montages. Its manic narrated monologue over tensely pulsing music and haunting shots moving from the sky into the city, into an empty office building at night, following a mail cart into a conference room packed with nervous workers who look like they're battling through an audit. Well, it's just masterful, and it was my roadmap from the start. The problem was, the day we shot Abel and Fred's part of this montage, I opted, wisely I think, to shoot it as a complete scene, beginning to end, and knowing I wanted to play up the comedy wherever I could, the scene evolved into a much sillier and more outlandishly oddball one than I'd initially envisioned.
Put me in the game, coach. Have a good one.
And the funny version was the most interesting way to watch the scene unfold. Remember my BFF Rachel from the Braintrust?
From the beginning of the film, when he's like at his computer and like has this opportunity and they're having that exchange, he's having that exchange with his boss, and then him in the suitcase, it felt like it was an everyday dude who'd watched The Matrix.
So the comedic intentions were working when I first showed an early cut to Rachel. The problem, though, when the scene was intercut as scripted with the operation going wrong, there was a serious tonal mismatch. Lacking context, the field op wasn't particularly funny and didn't need to be, but the scene with Abel and Fred was in a zany Dr. Strangelove or Burn After Reading kind of way. Jumping rapidly between oddball humor and Michael Clayton earnestness was problematic for a viewer. Here's Mark from the Braintrust on the first early cut of the movie he watched.
Yeah, there were 3 very different tones going on there, but they were all treated as if they should be played at the same pace. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. This sequence would require some of the heaviest lifting and inventiveness of any in the film, and it would also yield some of the greatest creative rewards of the entire process.
And maybe that was part of my problem is you have that through line in the score in the opening sequence right now that makes all those, that's connecting all those scenes. I mean, obviously they're connected through the cuts, but the tone is being kept consistent by the score. It doesn't change. It doesn't deviate. It doesn't suit each cut. It doesn't drop out. And maybe if you were, like, if you cut the score at the office, or if you were, like, to introduce, just cut the score and have, like, background noise of, like, phones ringing or some shit like that.
The first part of the solution came as an experiment, the type of drastic hypothesis an editor tests when backed into a corner like this. What if I just pulled the Abel and Fred scene out, playing it as a standalone scene to open the movie? There's no harm in trying any move you can, so I did, and that sequence worked far better by itself.
You're sure?
If I was you, sir, I wouldn't ask so many questions. You're now in the fold.
With the dialogue scene isolated as the opener, I now had a pile of snippets from the operation going haywire that were intended for a montage, and some temp nighttime city footage I'd thrown in to fill it out. The botched operation comes back 3 more times later in the movie in the form of Abel's flashbacks, divulging new information as the narrative moves along. Were I to show any more of the operation in the opening, I would ruin the suspense. The solution for this came in a few parts. Before diving into all the additions I would make to Counterintelligence, it bears noting that, for the most part, the script I wrote was intentionally pretty thin. My thought from the outset was, if I could stick to the characters and their predicaments within the simple structure, at worst, I'd tell a compelling and simple story. At best, I'd have plenty of space and room to add new elements to the equation. Riff a little once the cut was complete. At this point, my cut was very short, with each sequence pared down about as far as it could be, so I had room to add some flavor. Then, one day, I revisited one of my all-time favorite films.
A man named Hal Philip Walker excited a group of college students with some questions. Have you stood on a high and windy hill and heard the acorns drop and roll? Have you walked in the valley beside the brook, walked alone, and remembered? Does Christmas smell like oranges to you?
Robert Altman's Nashville tells the intertwining stories of 20-plus visitors and residents of Nashville, Tennessee, at the height of American political unrest in the mid-'70s. The mosaic is tied together by a constant narrator, a politician, Hal Philip Walker's voice playing over a loudspeaker driving through the city past the many characters at varying times preaching truths that no politician would ever say on the campaign trail. A light bulb went on for me, which then led me back to a similar motif used by Altman in another classic, MASH.
No, sir, that's the one he came in.
Oh, very good. Come along, my dear.
Follow Hawkeye, Trapper, Duke, Dago Red, Painless, Radar, Hot Lips, Dish, and Staff Sergeant Volmer as they put our boys back together again.
The now legendary loudspeaker voice on the military base in MASH acts as a narrator over the ensemble, going so far as to synopsize the movie and read the end credits.
Fred Williams and Indus Arthur, Tim Brown, Corey Fisher, Bud Cort,
Suddenly,
Carl
it
Dudley,
clicked.
Dawn Damon, Tamara
After opening with the scene where Fred tells Abel he's going into the field, I could then rebuild the opening montage with shots of Abel's car driving to the operation, intercutting with the operation itself. In the car, we would meet our film's radio narrator, a character I hatched in September of 2016, after the rough cut had been stitched together. His name would be Sidney Beale. He would be voiced by my good friend Anthony Redelsberger.
And what's happened is people think things. And then all these other thousands of people say, oh yeah, I think that too. And then they create websites and they create newspapers online and they write articles and they write blogs and they know their audience and they point these things to their audience. It's not true, but that doesn't matter. What you think, what you believe, what you want to think is true to you. If you want to believe it, it's not a fabrication. But you know what? It is. Things that aren't true are not factual.
So take yourself back to September of 2016. A lot was happening in the world. As I said at the end of episode 6, just before we began shooting, the political climate had flared up, to say the absolute least. Counterintelligence, a simple character-driven story that orbited around chains of command, idiots in charge, and self-interested politicians, was becoming even more relevant by fall of that year.
But it's important to be curious for everybody else. Because if you're not curious, That will have an adverse effect on the world.
Having had the idea for Sidney Beale's political talk radio show, where the anchor would address the human struggle on the ground in contemporary America outside of party politics, I reached out to Tony. Tony is a local actor with an amazing voice. He's seriously one of Portland's best-kept secrets. He's also politically conscious. We set up a time to meet up. I went to his house one night with a recorder and microphone. We had a beer or two, and I left with 2 hours of improvised Sidney Beale monologues on nearly every topic affecting U.S. citizens. This would be my cohesion, and that cohesion would kick off in the opening montage, tying it all together. Shortly after recording, I carved out 15 minutes of prime radio rants and peppered them across the rest of the film as well, mostly during sequences taking place in cars. Nearly every character in the film is listening to Sidney Beale's show at some point. They all belong to the same world now, and the movie was getting even tighter. Additionally, I was pleased with the opening now. From the causal scene with Abel and Fred transitioning into the view from Abel's dashboard as his car speeds through town to the operation, intercutting with the operation itself as it falls apart, all interwoven with the opening credits, layered over by pulsing music and Sid Beale's radio voice. It was finally working. Then, in November, something else happened in the world.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton. She congratulated us, it's about us, on our victory. And I congratulated her and her family on a very, very hard-fought campaign. I mean,
Listen, we can all be mature here. The undisputed reality is the country changed on Election Day 2016. Instead of veering into political territory, let's stick to how this impacted the movie. Portland's where we shot Counterintelligence and where for a week or more after the election, nationally covered protests carpeted the city nearly every night. I, and I'm sure many filmmakers and photographers, saw this as a moment to document. I went to the second night's protests with no expectations other than to capture the scene. And capture it, I did. It wasn't until I reviewed the footage the next day that it occurred to me, this is part of what Sid Beale was talking about in our radio show. The next morning, I added a host of shots from the protests to the opening montage, weaving throughout Abel's drive to the operation. And then I made some final title card additions. 2 early on and 1 near the end of the film, resetting the script set at any time in modern history to a movie taking place in the days following the 2016 election. The chaos of those days now set a new tone for the film and its characters. It's often asked of artists when they know something's done. Sometimes you just know. The only way I can put it, when it gets you most excited and closest to the feeling of losing yourself in your own movie. Mark echoed this when he saw the finished cut.
When I watched the new cut, that was one of the things I was most impressed with. Was it definitely, yeah, it gives us the conflict, or frames the conflict in a way that's much more easy to digest, at least as far as I was concerned, and you understand how these three stories are tying together.
The opening now created a richer stage and tapestry for the characters and the story's world. A stage we could slowly transition out of and into the story, having given the viewers a rapid overhead view of all the players in the game and their unique positions. And the beauty of ironing out this opening through riffs and experiments is I learned a lot about myself as a filmmaker. I learned that I enjoy that type of process more than any other, the hybrid between fabricated genre storytelling and real-life authenticity. I enjoy making fast-moving montages that relay dense information but flow like liquid. I enjoyed massaging that cut frame by frame, moment by moment until it moved just right, conveying just the right amount of information, making no viewers lost while leaving plenty of Easter eggs for repeated viewings. These are the films I like to watch, and hopefully viewers will feel that. The best way to see what viewers are feeling is to test them. As you've already heard, I brought back the Braintrust and a few others. I'd sit down with them, watching them watch the movie, taking in their immediate reactions, or sometimes lack thereof, I talk with them extensively after, sometimes walking away with pages of bulleted notes to take back and make changes with. Some big, some small, all important. It's important to remember that every tweak, nudge, move, deletion, and riff must always be in service of the story you're telling. I learned in my first film, The Painted City, that adding things, be they techniques, subplots, or sequences, just because you think they're cool, can be very problematic. It can result in a jumbled mess. Feel free to experiment in post. Play games with the story and the cuts. I moved scenes to completely new places. Sometimes they fit better where they landed. Sometimes they got moved back from whence they came. I would try things, then test them against different friends and family members. And this process of screening was almost never easy. Sometimes it was shattering.
It's hard for me to it was hard for me to be completely objective and transparent, because ultimately I felt like I was like you were hurt by my critiques. I was just trying to give him constructive criticism, and I feel like he took it a little bit. He takes, things a little bit personally, and he's worked on that a lot. But it was still hard to be completely honest.
And a huge part of taking constructive criticism is creating an environment where your viewer feels free and safe to be real with you. For most creative people, the process of receiving the notes that could shape their work for the better can be emotionally tumultuous. You'll hear artists say that their work is like their baby. No one likes to hear that their baby's ugly. And at some stage, your baby will be ugly. But one of the more powerful parts of that creative process can be the shaping, the sculpting. Taking notes from the braintrust and others, however hard that may be to hear, helps frame the work more objectively. Sometimes it's as simple as watching or listening to friends and family while they watch a cut. Sometimes you have to dig. You always have to contextualize every note within the framework of your story you want to tell. Some notes might not fit your vision. You, the artist, are the final arbiter of that vision. You get to choose. My main objectives with notes on counterintelligence were threefold: to gauge the balance between laughs and suspense, to ensure no one was ever bored, and to ensure everything that needed to make sense at each interval made sense. Notes helped me manage tone, pace, and clarity. Sometimes I'd get notes on aesthetic choices or specific plot events. I'd listen and always consider them, but most of the time, those were parts of the movie I intended to make. Sometimes those types of notes would point to other issues in the story that could be resolved by relocating certain scenes or reworking aesthetic choices so they blended better into the narrative. I'd go into detail on some of these, but they're all riddled with spoilers, so I guess you can make up your own mind when the movie's out. After all the major evolutions in storytelling arc, like adjusting the opening, moving a couple scenes around, and a late-stage ending change, most tweaks came down to single lines, shots, and changes at the frame level. This can drag on, and all the while, the forefront of my mind had to be calibrated to separating my ego from the project and laser-focused on making the most effective film possible. Focusing on the work had to remain at the forefront. Dre Tolbert was the person most involved in the months and months of screening and rescreening. And in case you forgot,
I don't know if you know this, but Christopher Stalker is my boyfriend.
She's not just my art director and co-producer, she's also my partner and cohabitant. This put her on the front lines, and those lines get blurred when they balance work and a relationship.
Writing it, and pre-production, and then shooting, and then post, and it's now January 5th, 2018, and I just wanted to be done with the movie, just because I missed my boyfriend.
And even though our situation is fairly specific, it speaks to a larger issue. Your partner, your friends, your family, they can get fatigued. Sometimes they just want their partner, friend, family member. This type of passion project can be all-consuming, demanding your constant focus, whether you want it to or not. Counterintelligence is comprised of approximately 125,000 frames. Each one demanded attention at some point. For me, the filmmaker, it's second nature. For others, even the most dedicated and loving people in your life, even your collaborators, it's a big ask to hope they feel the same. This is why studios get strangers in theaters to help. But you probably don't have those resources. We certainly didn't. I had to rely on those close to me and try my best not to burden them. After many viewings, they'll get too close to see objectively too, and that serves no parties involved. The post process, where you make the final movie, can go on and on and on. The best remedy, particularly if you're editing your own feature, is to force yourself to do what Dre does.
What I do when I get done with a job, I kind of just leave it in the past. I'm like, all right, on to the next one kind of thing. Kind of bury it, and it's dead to me. But then, like, when you see the outcome, it's like, oh my God, like, this is so cool. I was a part of this.
Bury it and all your emotional connections to it. Look at it as clear-eyed as possible. Try to view it as someone else's work and be as discriminating as you can. Try cutting things aggressively first. You can always add them back in later. This worked for me to a great extent on Counterintelligence, but there's always room for improvement, and there's far more to post-production than just editing.
But I don't really think about it, but you had to think about it because you had to edit it. You had to do colors, and so I just kind of felt that I lost you a little for a time, and we had a conversation about it. Is this going to make it in?
I don't know, maybe. It's pretty good stuff.
I know. And then we broke up.
But we still live together.
We still live together.
We're not actually breaking up.
No. Yeah. No, yes, no.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, we didn't break up. True love for the win. We stuck it out. She stayed with the project even after the cut was mostly done, and the real time-consuming tasks, the time sucks, the things that demanded the most attention and drug on the absolute longest began. More on those and true love next time. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. While you're there, you could totally leave us a rating or a comment or both if you so choose. Those are easy ways to help spread the word to other listeners who like the same stuff as you. Music for the show comes from our film, Counterintelligence, and was composed by the great Noah Simons, who you can find on SoundCloud or Bandcamp as Larians, Larians, and his band, Male Blonding, on Bandcamp, iTunes, and Spotify. They're super good. Make This Movie is brought to you by Showhawk Media. If you're a filmmaker who wants even more useful info and tools, visit showhawk.com/makethismovie and sign up to access our free micro-budget producer starter kit, including template spreadsheets, documents, and other great stuff we covered throughout this series, ready for you to fill in the blanks. That's showhawk.com/makethismovie. Visit counterflick.com for more information on Counterintelligence, the movie, including fun stuff like our satirical fake news page. Also on Facebook is Counterintelligence, Twitter, and Instagram @Counterflick. I'm Chris Socker. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.